So without wasting any time, let me turn now to Rochelle the Kock, who is editor of the Herald and Weekend Post in South Africa, I believe in Port Elizabeth. And
yes.
And we are you will be one of two colleagues from South Africa who will be addressing this M20 meeting about the situation in your country and the region. So over to you, Rochelle. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody. Thanks for the opportunity. And it's actually quite sobering to hear that the many challenges that have been raised before I started speaking are exactly the same things that we are, well, to an extent. I think for the most part in our democratic dispensation, it's very rare to hear of reporters being arrested in South Africa for being overly critical of those in power. But that's not to say that sometimes they do fail, the police that is, to protect a journalist when they are exposed to violence, whether it's out at protests, and that is something that we have a lot of in South Africa. In fact, it's almost a daily occurrence where there's protests. So we do have problems where the police fail to protect journalists, even when they are attacked, in public. In recent years, we have seen a rise in journalists who are being subjected to physical and verbal threats, as well as harassment. These could be in person, but for the most part, I would say in social media. That is a big problem that we are experiencing, and this is particularly prevalent in lead up to elective conferences of political parties, as well as the run up to elections. And we've got an election, a national general election coming up next year as well. So then we generally see an increase in this kind of harassment and attacks. They come from all corners, politicians, cabinet ministers even, who would be the ones that are starting off these smear campaigns, targeting a specific journalist perhaps, or even a group of senior established journalists, those who are particularly critical. We see this on social media, and then you have a situation where their supporters are then coming for those journalists too, and then begin harassing them and intimidating and even threatening them. And then you've actually, what we've seen now of late is some political parties placing a ban of sorts on some of the reporters covering their rallies and press conferences because their reporting is critical of them. And these are opposition parties, opposition political parties, and not necessarily just the ruling party. We've also seen that there's not enough pushback from people outside of the media landscape to protect journalists. And this is particularly problematic because it's almost as if you, as the media industry, are fighting this battle on our own. And the supporters often, as I mentioned, targeting reporters on social media, which is a lot to have to endure. Female journalists are particularly more prone to these attacks. A recent example was a case that really tested media freedom, in our country, and was this first ever private prosecution of a journalist that was led by a former president. He attempted to have her prosecuted for reporting on his court case. And he first tried the conventional route, but then the prosecuting authority declined to prosecute. And then he took the route of private prosecution. And then we had this journalist sitting in a dock as if she's, a criminal for just doing her job. And unfortunately, he did not succeed. And the High Court ruled that it had the hallmarks of strategic lawsuit against public participation, and therefore constituted an abuse of process. So I think that was quite encouraging for media, but I mean it's the fact that it actually had to get to that point that was very concerning. Sorry.
Yeah, we lost you in between. You said fortunately, the case was thrown out, right, by the High Court?
Yes, fortunately, yes, the High Court ruled that it had the hallmarks of strategic lawsuit against public participation, and therefore constituted an abuse of process. And so we were quite, happy that happened. But the mere fact that it took a journalist having to be, taking the route of private prosecution and standing in the dock there, that was a big problem for us. And the courts, unfortunately, are being used or even perhaps abused more often by those in authority and even business people wanting to muzzle the press. And this is a big challenge for us in the media industry, because it's costly having to defend these cases, and continuously having to come up with some kind of support. And we see this as an attempt to muzzle the industry. Like some of our colleagues have mentioned earlier on, the media houses are battling. They're battling to stay afloat, revenue loss, sales revenue is dwindling. And I think it's a particular challenge of the public in general, battling to hold their heads above water in South Africa in a general economic circumstance. And they can't necessarily afford subscriptions. And we've had to, with print figures, particularly in the print industry, with print figures dwindling, we've employed like paywalls and having to push digital subscriptions, but the uptake is not really as great as we would like to. And I think to a large extent, it's a case of, do you buy a loaf of bread or do you pay a subscription for some people? And I think that's where radio becomes a particularly popular medium in South Africa. We've also have a big problem. Our newsrooms are shrinking. And I think it's a problem across the board. There's an over-reliance on smaller team, and this has created some mental health problems, because we're having, fewer people having to take on more work. And the other, impact of this being that, the standard of reporting has deteriorated. We have these over juniorized newsrooms. We can't compete with the salaries of the rest of corporate and even government institutions, who are poaching, some of the senior journalists within the industry. We can't compete with those salaries. We've also noted an increased intimidation and harassment of reporters while out in the field. And I think there's also the problem of overly punitive legislation that is hampering our abilities to report. At times gaining access to information is particularly difficult, from the government. And it's almost as if there's no transparency, and we're really struggling. And then you've got to put what we call PIA applications in just to get access to that information, and that is a tedious process that we're really having to deal with. And so there's this over-reliance, I would say, on leaked reports, and which is fine, but I think it shouldn't be that difficult for some things that are in the public's interest. So trust in the media in South Africa has waned over the years. And this is largely as a result of this, as fake news phenomenon. And as I said, also, trusted media practitioners then leaving the industry to join political parties, even as their spokespeople, and also in government positions, and even analysts that go on to join political parties. And I think this has to a large extent created a problem when it comes to trust. The challenge that I've mentioned now have been raised by, whether it's individual media houses, but also through the South African National Editors Forum. They've, SANEF has engaged with Minister of Police, ministers in the presidency, and others, but we don't really see much of a change. I don't know if perhaps there's just not an appetite to take this, seriously, some of the challenges that we've got out in the field. And I think the general concern that we have about the media industry in South Africa is that it is struggling. and the newsrooms are shrinking. The industry as a whole is shrinking. Yeah, that's my contribution for now.
Thank you very much, Rochelle.